This is TWiT. We had, you may remember Jim Salter on the show a few months ago to talk about the Wirecutter's review of mesh routers. We thought we'd have him back. He's working on a new router guide for the Wirecutter. Hi, Jim.
How you doing, Leo?
Great to see you. Welcome back.
Jim, I believe I was on the show last time we talked about routers.
Coinky dink or what?
Sure.
That's great. Now, last time you were on, you were reviewing the big, whatever it is 8, 10 mesh routers. I know the Wirecutter.
Tons of them.
Yep, a lot of them. Currently picks the Orbi as the kind of the powerhouse. Although best runner-up, I think, was Eero. And what was the third choice? I think there was a Plume, which is what you were using at the time, and I ended up using because of you. Eero, we should mention, is a sponsor. So what are you doing differently now?
I'm testing with multiple clients now, which is something that I've been working towards for a while. Instead of trying to do this thing where you're just hooking up a laptop and trying to get a big number and say, yay, big number, we're done. I'm modeling an entire network.
Yeah, because nobody, I mean, I look at my Plume setup and I've got 42 devices hooked up to those routers. Nobody uses just one client. Everybody has an increasingly massively complex setup. How do you do this? Do you have a test home or is this in your house?
Yeah, I'm living in my test home, unfortunately. You know what they say? Everybody's got a test network. Some people are lucky enough to have a separate production environment. I'm not one of those people.
Yeah, I know. I have 2 internet connections, so I can try different routers. But it's not really a good environment because I feel like they're probably interacting with each other. So it's not the ideal setup. So what are you testing? You said before on the show that you're testing standalone Wi-Fi routers right now.
Yeah, right now, and it's a little odd because the multiple client testing stuff really lends itself to mesh, and different mesh devices are really gonna it's really gonna showcase the difference between the mesh devices better. But the standalone router guide is what we're updating right now, so that's where the test method gets debuted. I've got 4 different networks, or 4 different laptops, I'm sorry, scattered around the house. And they each are doing something like what you might be doing. One of them is simulating downloads. One of them is simulating web browsing where you're just clicking, going from page to page. Another one, a voice over IP phone call. And then finally, the last one is streaming 4K TV.
Holy cow. And I'm guessing that you notice this impacts the routers in a much different way than just a single computer hooked up.
Oh, yeah, tremendously. I mean, I knew it was going to, but, it's one thing to talk about it and say, oh, well, it's different when you've got these devices doing different things. It's another thing entirely to actually show it happening.
And that's the home of the future, too. Right?
It's the home of the present for me.
That's very true. Yes, yes.
Anybody who has kids, they're guarantee you they're watching something different than mom and dad are watching.
Gotta watch Netflix in 4K.
Right, and I have a network-attached storage device. It's probably always down. In fact, I was really amazed when I first started using these mesh routers. Some of them will give you usage information. Plume's just added that to their app to see how much bandwidth these devices are using.
Who is staying on their computer all night?
It's crazy. I was surprised that I had exceeded Comcast's terabyte a month's bandwidth. Oh. Now I'm not surprised. I'm surprised I don't exceed it all the time. I mean, that's normal,
Jim, I have a question for you. Have you heard anything about what Samsung's coming out with their mesh router wiring system thingamabob?
Yeah, because they bought
I actually had not.
Yeah.
That is a completely new one on me.
Oh. Okay.
Get ready. You got more to test.
Well, I wanted your opinion.
You got more testing to do.
It's not out yet, but I believe it's coming out. Yeah, they have the Connect Home. They're doing their own mesh Wi-Fi.
Yeah, because they bought SmartThings, so they've got that hub.
And it's built in, yeah.
And it makes sense. I think that's what everybody, Apple and Google and everybody else probably eventually are going to do is some sort of using, as long as you've got this hub, using it as a smart home hub.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. That's
coming up
next month.
I'm curious about it because, I mean, mesh routing seems to be like the cool new thing in this day and age.
Well, that's a good question. So you're testing standalone routers. When should you use a standalone router? When should you use a mesh system?
At this point, honestly, unless you live in a small apartment, you really should be using some kind of mesh. Whether it's Wi-Fi mesh or whether you've got several wired backhaul access points like Ubiquiti or Ingenius's stuff. We probably really need to be moving beyond this idea of I have my Wi-Fi router singular and that's it.
Why is that? What are the real problem areas?
So the big problem is that, the more of these devices that you have, the more likely that lots of them are talking to the router from all over the house. And when you've only got one single access point, you can have a lot of problems above and beyond the simple. You think like, oh, well, it's further away, so I have less signal. Or there's walls in between, so I have less signal. There are more problems than that. RF multipath in particular is going to be a worse problem the more distance and the more walls and the more devices that you've got going at all. And it sounds very technical, RF multipath, but basically it's the same thing as just an echo, but it's for radio instead of your voice.
If you drive downtown listening to FM radio, you know what multipath sounds like because the signal's bouncing off of high rises and it sounds terrible. Well, bad sound is going to translate to data loss if you're on a Wi-Fi router.
Absolutely. So, even the mesh systems that aren't actually splitting the access points up onto multiple bands, which ticks me off because they should be, because that works better. Even without that, you still get some benefit out of it because your devices are closer and they get a better connection and they use up less airtime for the same amount of bandwidth.
So pretty much you're saying if you're in a studio apartment, you can use a single router. In fact, it'd be crazy to use a mesh. Where are you going to put the other ones? But anyone else, if you've got more than a few rooms, you want to spread the Wi-Fi out with these mesh router systems. The last time I read the Wirecutter, you were very high on the TP-Link Archer C7 router, mostly because it was a very good router for a very low price. I know you can't tell us the results yet because you're still in testing. But do you think, do you see any up-and-comers? Let's ask that question.
I've personally always been really fond of Netgear stuff in the consumer space, and I can tell you that it's been doing very well in these rounds of testing that I've been doing so far. If you want to, we can look at some of the graphics from that a little bit later and kind of go through what makes the difference.
So you still have the C7 in there, I see.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I kind of have to because we've been recommending that really strongly. It's been our recommendation bar none. So at the very least, we should be looking at it, right?
Right.
And this first slide that we're looking at, it's what I like to call easy mode testing, which means that each one of these routers I've manually set up separate SSIDs, network names. And I've joined the various devices carefully to what I feel like is the best SSID for that name to, split it up and kind of load balance things manually. And so all these routers, they do reasonably well with that. The C7 actually does less well than most of them. It's only dual band, and that C5400 is a tri-band router. So there's more channels to split the workload up from, so it did better. But again, this is really a little bit misleading because who really sits there and carefully only connects their devices to just the right SSID for that point in time in relation to what everybody's doing? Nobody. So the next slide really is a little more accurate, I think.
Let's see
when we do the hard mode testing.
Whoa, and you can see those reds are not good, right?
Wow.
Yeah, those reds are absolutely terrible. We went from, a mediocre pass on the C7 in the easy mode where I carefully tested I carefully split everything up. What we're looking at in this slide, the hard mode, is where there's only one network name. And you can join either the 2.4 gigahertz or the 5 gigahertz radio, but it's all one name and you don't think about which one your device is connecting to. Well, the Archer products don't do any load balancing. So if you only set up one single network name, all of your devices are going to hop right onto the 5 gigahertz, and you don't get to share any of the workload with the other radio. And as you can see, that results in an absolutely terrible experience when all four of these devices are trying to do their thing at once.
Wow, look at that. Wow.
Now you can see the C5400 did a little bit better. It's got 3 radios in it, and all devices still ended up on one single 5 gigahertz radio, but it did a little bit better. I'm not entirely sure why.
Isn't that funny? That's one of the things mesh routers do well, right? Is they split you up among different radios.
Yeah, exactly, the load balancing. And that brings us to the Linksys device. That's the first one in this slide that actually does offer load balancing, but it's not very bright. It doesn't use the 2.4 gigahertz radio at all. This is another tri-band router. It's got 2 5 gig radios, and it only load balances between the 2 of those. And it's not actually load balancing. The documentation says that it picks, and I quote, the strongest signal for any given device. But I mean, both radios are in the same tiny little plastic box. Right. So other than, some weird artifact of, again, RF multipath, you're not going to see any difference. And in fact, that's, I say that's hard mode, like I just let it do its own thing. But for the Linksys, sort of yes, sort of no. All 4 devices hopped onto the same 5 gigahertz radio, and I actually sat there and just disconnected it and reconnected one like 5 times before I managed to get it to just randomly finally decide to switch to the other one.
Wow.
Now, if you go back to the slide we were just looking at again, and you look down at the bottom on that Netgear R8000, that's also a tri-band device, but the Netgear does smart band steering. It knows that it should be load balancing. It's not doing some silly thing like, what's the strongest signal? And it did use all 3 radios for my 4 devices, and as you can see, it did a much better job.
Wow, yeah, noticeably. Wow. So that just shows you it's not necessarily how much power, it's not necessarily how many antennas on the outside. There seems to be a horrific trend among manufacturers now to add more antennas for no apparent reason. It really
Which Netgear is really bad about that.
I know. I have an Asus
like
that looks like an upside down spider. I don't understand what they're thinking. But it's the intelligence in the router, and this is something fairly new that they're putting this kind of intelligence into a router.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's good news, and I look forward to seeing your review. That'll be how soon on the wirecutter.com?
I would guess probably about mid-July.
Yeah.
I'll be done with testing next week, but there's a pretty lengthy editorial process that goes into putting those things together, so I can't really give like an exact publish date, unfortunately. I'd love to.
If a router, one of these routers, for instance, costs nearly as much as mesh, that's one of the disadvantages of meshes, of course. These tend to be very expensive. Would it be worth getting a single router, or is a mesh always a better solution? By the way, the plume I'm using because you told me to, so I'm just...
Look, all the red.
just not happy. I might have to go back to my Orbi, except I gave it to Megan. Now, what's this R8000? Is that a mesh? That must be one of the newer mesh.
No, that's the same one from the last slide.
So it outperformed the mesh routers.
It did in this case, and the reason for that is, so the Orbi there, you'll notice, didn't do quite as well.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because even though the Orbi is also a tri-band product, one band is reserved for the Wi-Fi backhaul.
Right.
So effectively, there's only 2 bands to split the workload up from.
Right.
Plume did not do as well as it could have with that test. Sometimes the cloud optimizer just does not do the best job of setting up topology, and unfortunately, this was one of those cases.
Does it get better over time, or is this what I'm going to be stuck with?
If it's not doing well, you can call support, and they can kind of kick it and make it do something different. There's not much that you can do directly to jigger the cloud optimizer around. It kind of does what it wants to do, and sometimes, most of the time, it does a really good job. But sometimes it does like what you saw there, and it just reuses the same band too many times. And if it does that, now to be fair, if you were comparing that to those standalone routers, it's still looking pretty good. But yeah, compared to the tri-band, it's not doing well then.
There's
another thing to note.
Go ahead.
Another thing to note, though, this was a fairly small environment. These tests were only taking place on the top floor of my house.
Right.
If we included downstairs, none of those standalone routers would have, they would have failed entirely.
So that's when you start saying the extra expense for a mesh router is worth it. If you have a complex environment either spread out or you've got multiple floors, it makes a big difference to have a mesh system.
It does. And keep in mind, even these tests, I've got a whopping 4 devices hooked up.
That's nothing. I told you I have 40 plus devices. Yeah.
Exactly. I can't model everything with what I've got here. So there are some other advantages to mesh that we're not seeing, but I think where it's going to get really interesting is when we really start hammering all the mesh devices with this setup and seeing what the differences are between them.
You can see now why there's so much kind of anecdotal and opinionated. You go to Reddit and you read about this. Everybody has a different opinion. RF is very complicated and very tricky, and it's hard to say there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer, that is a definitive correct answer. And so there are a lot of opinions, and none of them are all wrong. Yeah. I don't know if any of them are all right either. This is a tough thing, and this is unfortunately one of the things everybody is facing: how to get better Wi-Fi. I don't know.
Plenty of those opinions are all wrong.
Okay, there are some really bad ones. I agree. Yeah. I read them all the time.
You know, one of the big things is that some of the most technical people that are trying to give answers on this stuff, they're not using Wi-Fi the way that the less technical people are, so they're not very good at advising them.
I was going to ask Jim, did you, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to ask, did you get a chance to test like a lot of different maybe smartphones on this network? So sort of
sounds like all laptops.
Yeah, I imagine like a household just full of, because my problems, my pain points have always been when I have people come over to my house and they go, Flo, your Wi-Fi's slow, and I thought you were the techie, and then I got a mesh network.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you really want to have fun, throw some Apple stuff in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing that I see over and over and over is, you know, people complaining that literally only certain Apple devices aren't working with their Wi-Fi and everything else works
Very
great.
common. Yeah.
Pretty frustrating.
For a while, iPads were banned on one college network because they would bring the whole network down because of how they worked.
Never mind all the pirating of movies. iPads are not allowed at the dorms.
I think they fixed that problem, just to be fair to Apple. They've definitely fixed that problem.
But yeah, in general, you know, your more technical people, they're not actually using Wi-Fi much. It's just the throwaway thing for the phones.
Right.
And it works fine because they don't have but, you know, one or two phone doing anything, and it's usually not doing anything that big.
Yeah.
But then you get into a consumer house and they want to do everything. It looks a lot more like this model network that I've set up where you've got, you know, streaming and browsing and downloading and, you know, VoIP calling and everything all going on, and it's all supposed to coexist. And, you know, they're not gonna go through and like connect one device to one network and a different one to a different one to get like the max big number. So you really have to test it the way people are going to use it, which is just connect it all up and hope for the best.
And then there are other issues that you can't test. Things, Netgear's had problems with firmware security in the past. One of the things the mesh router manufacturers do seem better at is firmware updates. They seem to be working harder to keep their stuff up to date.
I would agree with that completely. I mean, the big reason that I got away from normal routers and did the build my own thing was just not being willing to deal with updates happening whenever they happen, and usually manual, and you have to know about it and go find it and download and install it.
Not consumer friendly.
Mesh is really Mesh is a lot more consumer friendly.
Oh, absolutely. You just hook it in and it works.
Everything but the price. But we're all suffering the Wi-Fi blues. And Jim, I thank you for doing the research you're doing to help us cut through it. And that's one of the things that Wirecutter is so good at. The Wirecutter.com. I read it religiously and recommend it all the time.
That's how we make all of our purchases in our home.
Yeah, it pretty much is, yeah.
You know, I would like to mention the price thing, though. It's not that bad. If you're going from a cheap router to mesh, it's a big jump. You're going from, you know, like $90 to, you know, $300, $350. But those tri-band routers we were looking at, most of those are in the $200 to $250 price range. So you really have to ask yourself at that point, you know, is it that big a deal to spend the extra $100 for the mesh?
Do it. Please.
It's probably
There's
not.
the spider.
Yeah, that's the spider. Do it. Do it. Do it. I highly recommend it. I've gone mesh and I'll never go back. Although I have to say, one of the problems with Plume, and I think there's going to be a problem with the new Eero beacons, you plug them into the wall, you can't really pick where they are. I actually took an extension cord and hung my Plume up here so that it would have better, the router, the main Plume, so it would have better access to all the other, the things we do. I mean, it's almost down to putting tin foil on them and holding and...
You gotta do what you gotta do, Leo. It's okay.
The router's not working. Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Leo.
Take care. Jim Salter, thewirecutter.com.